Некоторые из вас уже были на наших предыдущих лекциях, но я коротко расскажу, в чем был наш замысел. Да, когда мы думали, чему посвятить лекции в этом большом сезоне, мы думали о том, что мы часто говорим о экономической политике, мы часто говорим о каких-то реформах, политических мерах, и гораздо реже говорим о тех идеях, которые на самом деле за такими мерами могут стоять. Вот. И часто оказывается, что сами по себе идеи, да, даже в том случае, если за ними стоят какие-то благие намерения, могут нести внутри себя угрозу. И таким образом, да, вот мы подумали, что мы живем в мире, где существуют такие идеи, которые на самом деле уже доказали свою несостоятельность, но при этом они ходят в этой социальной реальности вокруг нас и причиняют людям разный вред. Да, и такие идеи мы решили назвать зомби-идеями. Вот. И понятно, да, что мы можем говорить о каких-то вещах, которые гораздо более понятные и бесспорные. Да, в частности, не знаю, говорить про гомеопатию, да, потому что там есть отдельная научная база, да, совершенно понятная, которая показывает, что гомеопатия не работает. Да, или обсуждать, не знаю, идею какого-нибудь… то, что Земля плоская. Вот, да, но это все вещи достаточно понятные и бесспорные, и обсуждать их не очень интересно. Вот, а мы подумали, что лучше посмотреть на те идеи, которые на самом деле не так очевидны, да, потому что на самом деле они вот, с первого взгляда могут казаться вполне здравыми. Вот, и поэтому в этом сезоне мы говорили уже о целой серии таких идей. Да, у нас была лекция про зомби-идею геополитики, да, лекция про идею государственности. Да, такой был зомби-государственник, который показывал, к чему может привести избыточная надежда на то, что государство может вмешаться и отрегулировать жизнь граждан. Да, мы говорили о том, вот в прошлый раз, например, о том, к чему приводит надежда на то, что мы можем предсказывать и планировать будущее, и, исходя из этого, предугадывать какие-то последствия и уже сейчас их менять. И вот сегодня мы хотим поговорить про такое еще одного зомби, его зовут зомби-прокурор, вот, и о нем расскажет американский журналист Радли Балко. Да, и если вкратце, да, то это тот самый зомби, который ходит и говорит, что на самом деле наша задача наказывать всех преступников, да, потому что это кажется очень очевидным, что если есть преступники, их нужно посадить в тюрьму. И вот сейчас Радли расскажет вам, что за этой идеей стоит и к чему она может привести. Радли, you're welcome.
Thank you. And thank you to In Liberty for inviting me to Moscow for the first time, or my first time in Moscow. You have a beautiful city here. So the topic of this lecture series is zombie ideas. These are the idea that there are ideas and philosophies that have sort of been buried and need to be resurrected, need to be brought back. What I'm going to talk about is the idea of punishment as rehabilitation. The idea that we should think about our prisons, think about our incarceration system, think about our police and our courts and our prosecutors as ways to sort of improve people who have done wrong as opposed to sort of punish them and make them feel pain for what they've done wrong. And it goes against a lot of our primary instincts, right? We want to punish people who hurt other people, right? There's a very strong kind of instinct to make people feel the same pain that they've inflicted on other people, right? This is a biblical idea, an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth. The problem is that it isn't very practical. It doesn't work. It doesn't actually make society safer. But before I sort of get into that, I want to talk about the primary reasons that we do punish people and talk about why rehabilitation, I think, is the one that we should, the main reason we should sort of be shooting for or opting for. there are four kind of reasons why we put people in prison, why we punish people after they commit crimes. The first is what you might call for protection, right? We try to keep bad people away from us so that they don't harm, they don't hurt more people. And for some people, for clear sociopaths, for serial killers, for repeat offenders, this makes sense. We have to do this, right? It's the only sort of option that is available to us. But the overwhelming majority of people who commit crimes, even violent crimes, don't go on to repeat them. And in fact, there have just been some studies out in the US on recidivism rates that show they're much, much lower than we even anticipated 5 or 10, 15 years ago. Most people tend to commit crimes at a very narrow age range, usually between the ages of 16 and 19 or 20. And if you look at the graph of what age people are when they commit crimes, it peaks right about there, about 19 or 20, and then it just dives straight down to the point where most people, by the time they hit their 30s, very few of them ever go on to commit a crime again. So in the US, we have this, there's been this trend toward life without parole, this idea of putting in people in prison with no chance of getting out ever. And maybe for repeat murderers or repeat rapists, that kind of sentence makes sense. But the vast majority of people who make mistakes when they're young, people who maybe commit robberies when they're young, people who lose sort of control of their temper, their emotions when they're young, that type of long sentence doesn't do a lot of good. It's very expensive. It costs a lot of money to keep people in prison that long. And again, by the time they hit 25, 30, particularly in their mid-30s, they're just not a threat to society anymore. And so it does us no good. It does them no good. It does their families, their neighborhoods no good. I'll get into that in a little bit later, to keep them in prison for that long. So there is a protective effect for punishment and incarceration. That we can't sort of overlook that. There are people that do need to go away and be kept away from us so that they don't hurt or victimize more people. But it's a very, very small segment of the criminal population that is sort of beyond hope, who are beyond redemption. Let's talk about, I'll get a little bit more into protective effects later. Let's talk about the deterrent effect. So this is the idea that if we have very severe punishments for crimes, it will dissuade people from committing those crimes in the future. There's just not much evidence for this at all. There is a bit of a deterrent effect if the punishment is swift and certain. Those are the two. Mark Kleiman, a criminologist at UCLA in the US, has done a lot of work on this and found that there is a deterrent effect. You can get people you can get crime rates to go down if you can convince communities that if they commit certain crimes, they certainly will be punished, and that punishment will come very quickly after the crime. The problem is, in the US, and as I understand it here in Russia as well, I think we're number one and you're number two in incarcerating our people. So in both countries, I think this is a problem, that we have too many laws. We have too many laws that can, way too many laws that can be enforced sort of across the board, right? In the US, we have so many laws. In fact, there was a book written a few years ago called 3 Felonies a Day. That basically argued convincingly, I think, that if you live in the United States and you have any sort of complicated life, let's say you own a business or two, or maybe you have more than one job, basically it is impossible for you to live in the United States without committing at least 3 felonies a day. There are some laws in the US where if you own a business, it's impossible for you to comply with one law without breaking another law. And so what happens is when you have that many laws, when prosecutors have that much discretion and that wide a range of power to enforce the laws, you no longer become a nation of laws. You no longer become a nation that's governed by the rule of law. You become a nation that's governed by men or women in the prosecutors' positions. They can now choose which laws they want to enforce because they can't possibly enforce them all. They can also now choose who they get to enforce those laws against and who they don't enforce them against. This is a problem, I think, with a lot of Western and developed countries. As countries get more and more developed, their politicians get what I have called there ought to be a law syndrome, which is that every time something happens in society that bothers them or irks them or rubs them the wrong way, they want to make that activity illegal. And so activities that we used to correct with, say, family members and relatives and friends or churches or communities, we now look to the criminal justice system to correct those problems. And this is how we get these kinds of vast codes of laws that we have. In the United States, there have been several efforts to just count the number of laws that we have in the US, and they've given up in frustration. Most of them put the number somewhere between 4,000 and 5,000 at the federal level. But we also have state and local laws. Also, all the regulations that the federal government has can be enforced criminally as well as regulatory. In other words, you can go to prison for regulatory violations or you can be fined. So when you have that many laws, they just don't serve very well as a deterrent because the punishment may come or it may not. The prosecutor doesn't have enough resources to enforce all the laws all the time against all the people. So people start to lose respect for the law. They lose respect for the rule of law. And so law no longer becomes a deterrent for bad behavior because it's not certain that you're going to be punished. It's not certain you're going to be caught. If you are caught, it could be years before you're punished. We have people in the US who wait years just to go to trial, just to have their actual trial to decide if they're guilty or innocent. A Pew study in 2013 in the states of Florida, Michigan, and Maryland found that when you increase sentences, when you start adding years to sentences for various crimes, there's really no effect on the length of sentence versus the crime rate. So if you give people 5 years for armed robbery versus 20 years, it doesn't really change the frequency with which people commit armed robbery. What does change it is if you hire more prosecutors to make sure that everybody who commits an armed robbery actually gets prosecuted for it. That tends to make the crime rate go down. But merely adding years on to sentences has very little effect on the crime rate at all. So that's the deterrent effect. We've got the protective effect. Let me talk a little bit more about the protective effect. So one of the other things that we've started doing in the US, because it's a very politically popular thing to do, is we've started to, every year we find something new and mean that we can do to people who have been convicted of sex offenses. This is a very unpopular group of people, right? It's very easy to sort of find new ways to punish them over and over again. And in fact, now in the US, if you're convicted of various sex crimes, not only are you probably going to go to prison for a long time, even after you've served your sentence, the courts have now decided that we can put a GPS monitor on your ankle to track you wherever you go. You can be put on sex offender lists, which are now published publicly on the internet. A lot of times you'll have to notify all your neighbors before you can move anywhere. There's several cities have now passed ordinances banning sex offenders from living within 50 feet or 100 feet or 500 feet or 1,000 feet of any place where children may gather, which includes sort of churches and playgrounds and bus stops, to the point where there are cities now where sex offenders live under bridges because there's nowhere else for them to live. In some places they live sort of in little enclaves in the woods because there's no place in the city left for them to actually live. Some of these people did very serious, terrible things. Some people did very serious, terrible things to children. Some people were caught urinating outside of a bar in public and were convicted of indecent exposure. Some of them were people who were 19 and then had sex with their girlfriend who was 17 at the time, which technically was illegal under state law, and the girlfriend's parents wanted to punish the guy, and now he's sort of punished for the rest of his life. The point here is this is a very easy group to pick on. The problem is study after study after study has shown that these extra punishments that we heap on these people don't actually make the country safer. There's a very popular belief that sex offenders have very high recidivism rates, higher than other types of crimes. In fact, the opposite is true. They're actually less likely to go on to commit sex crimes than people who commit other types of crime. Now, this isn't to say we shouldn't take these crimes seriously. Of course we should. But if you have a policy that is heaping this extra punishment on people after they've served their sentences, and it's not helping them reintegrate into society, you're actually sort of making it more likely for them to reoffend, right? Because at this point, what do they have to lose? I'm living under a bridge. I can't get a job. I have to sort of announce myself wherever I go. You can't have a relationship. A lot of them aren't allowed to attend churches because children go to church. So this, again, is an effort to sort of have a protective effect with our criminal justice system that really has backfired. It's not making us safer. It is sort of heaping punishment on this group of people that justifiably aren't very well liked, but it's doing nothing to actually make society safer. And in fact, it may be making us less safe. So let's talk about the main reason why, and this kind of gets into the sex offender stuff also, the main reason why we punish people, and that is retribution, right? We want to punish people who hurt other people. This is a very, very natural instinct. It's a very human instinct. The problem is that it, again, retributive punishment does not make us safer. And the way we've gone about punishing people in the US, and again, I can only speak for the US, has not only inflicted punishment on the people who actually commit the crimes, it inflicts punishment on their children, on their families, on their communities. In fact, there are studies that have shown that entire neighborhoods can be affected by just one person in that neighborhood being sent to prison. And in fact, in the US, we have entire neighborhoods where so many people now have criminal records and so many people have been to prison that you have this sort of the reversing of culture where police are seen as sort of the enemy, where prosecutors are seen as the enemy, where the criminal justice system is seen as sort of the criminals. And when everybody has a criminal record, nobody has a criminal record, right? There's nothing to sort of distinguish the sort of good people from the bad people. Studies have shown that when people get out of prison, their yearly earnings fall by about 40%. They also stay stagnant. They have very little hope for increasing the income over the rest of their lives. There's no advancement. About half of the jail and prison population in the United States has a child under the age of 18. Those children are much, much more likely to be depressed. They're much more likely to drop out of school. They're much more likely to later go on to have a criminal record of their own. So when we incarcerate people sort of just to punishment, just to inflict pain on them, we are also inflicting pain on their children, on their families, on their communities, on the people around them. And even that, maybe that would be okay if the punishment that we're inflicting on them and their children and their families and the people around them was making us sort of safer in the whole, in the aggregate. But again, all of the data suggests that that isn't true. So we're kind of fulfilling this primal sort of urge that we have to inflict pain on people who hurt other people, but we're basically inflicting pain on ourselves in the process. We're making our society less safe, and we're actually harming these communities and sort of robbing these communities of achieving their full potential. So in the US, we also have this problem where once you have a record, it becomes very difficult to get a job. There's a box that you have to check when you fill out an application for a job of whether you've ever been, a lot of times even arrested for a crime, much less convicted of one. And this, again, becomes a very crippling effect on the ability of people to sort of find themselves after they get out of prison. So those are all sort of what I would consider the wrong reasons to punish people, right? The turn effect doesn't work. I think retribution feels good, but it doesn't actually make us safer. There's no evidence that it makes us safer. For protection, there are people for whom we have to protect the rest of society from, and in that sense, protection makes sense. But what we should really be shooting for is rehabilitative. We are flawed human beings, right? We all make mistakes. We should victims of crime should obviously be made whole, but we should, our incarceration system or punishment system should be geared toward helping people who have offended sort of better themselves, and in the process better society. So there was a University of Chicago study that came out a couple of years ago that found that the more time people spend in prison does not necessarily make them less criminal in the end, right? You are not less likely to reoffend if you spend more time in prison. If you commit an armed robbery and you live in a state where the sentence is 15 years versus the sentence is 5 years, people who live in the state where the sentence is 15 years are no less likely to reoffend than when it's 5 years. So again, these longer sentences don't really do much good. Let's go back a little bit. We're talking about zombie ideas, right? And these ideas that sort of need to be resurrected from the grave. So the very first prison in the United States was called Eastern State Penitentiary. It's in Philadelphia. You can still visit it. It's kind of old and falling apart. It's got this kind of beautiful urban decay thing going on. They do haunted houses in it at Halloween. It was started by Ben Franklin, sort of one of the founding fathers of the United States. But it was also started by the Quaker religion. And at the time in the United States, we didn't have prisons. Basically, if somebody committed a murder, you would have a trial. And if they were found guilty, they would be hanged. And if they were found innocent, they would be set free. Any lesser crime was handled in a very sort of private way. The aggrieved victim's party would hire a prosecutor. They would go to a grand jury. The grand jury would decide, you know, if you were being accused, you would hire a lawyer to represent you, and then the jury would decide whether the person was guilty or innocent. And the punishment was you would have to make the victim whole. So if you were accused of stealing the horse, your neighbor's horse, you would have to buy them a horse or give them one of your horses. If you were accused of, you know, punching them or inflicting some sort of physical violence on them, you would have to pay their medical records and maybe a little bit more for pain and suffering. It wasn't really until about the 1900s that we got this idea of a professional prosecutor, that the idea of prosecuting crimes would be a state position with a state actor, and this person would be paid just for the purpose of prosecuting crimes and sending people to prison. We also didn't have police departments in the United States until about the early 1900s. Before that, you had county sheriffs, but their job was sort of administrative. Basically, law enforcement was sort of handled, again, in a kind of a private way. You would round up posses, and people would sort of take care of things in their own way. And I'm not saying we need to go back to that system. I am saying, though, that what happened in the 1900s is we created these positions, these state positions, whose sole job it is to arrest people for crimes, prosecute people for crimes, and put people in prison for crimes. And we have to realize that that created a strong incentive for the people who filled those positions to find lots of crimes, for there to be lots of crimes, for us to pass more laws so that there are more crimes that can be committed. The people who occupy these positions have a very, very strong incentive to sort of see the world as not as citizens with rights, but as sort of potential criminals for them to put in prison. But, so I want to go back to Eastern State Penitentiary. This is the first prison in the U.S. It was built in the late 1700s. The purpose of Eastern State Penitentiary was not to punish people. It was started by Quakers, the Quaker religion, and the idea was actually it was supposed to be a rehabilitative prison. They sent murderers there. Some of their techniques, even by today's standards, would seem a little odd. There was a lot of solitary confinement. They were forced to pray, even if they weren't religious. They would be in these rooms that sort of looked like churches. But everybody was taught a trade, so that when they got out, they would be useful to society again. There was this idea that, you know, once you were sort of got right with God and sort of mended your ways, you would now have this trade and you could be a productive member of society. And it was a much sort of healthier approach to incarceration. And that in the US is actually the approach we took for a very long time until about the late 1960s, early 1970s. And this is when the crime rate started soaring in the United States. We started to see some rioting in the cities, race-related riots. And the response from the politicians was, we need to crack down on crime. And the response was that nothing's working, rehabilitation isn't working, it's hopeless, these people are just born bad, they're just evil, we just need to sort of lock them up and throw away the key. And that has been the incarceration policy in the United States basically for my lifetime, probably for about the last 40 years or so. And it's been enormously destructive. Our prison population has spiraled out of control. We have now, I believe it's over 1% of the population is either in prison or on probation or parole. So over 1 in every 100 people. And in the African American community especially, in the black community, you're looking at 1 in 4, sometimes 1 in 3 black men have served prison time in some way or another. And it's been sort of a disastrous and destructive policy in the United States, this move from sort of rehabilitation to a more sort of retributive form of justice. So the problem is it doesn't have to work this way. The idea that these people are hopeless, there's just not much evidence for that. There was a study, a pilot program done recently at the jail, the city jail in San Francisco, where they did sort of intense re-education efforts for even violent inmates. And what they found was, let me get my numbers here right, after just 4 months in this sort of intense re-education effort where they were given counseling, they were basically sort of either given education credits toward a degree or to some sort of trade license, they found that violence in the jail decreased by 83% after 4 months of this program. And after a year of the program, violence in the jail in San Francisco decreased to 0. They had no incidents for an entire year, 1 year after this program was implemented. If we look at countries that do implement a more rehabilitative effort, there's a study out of Norway. Norway is sort of famous or infamous, I guess, depending on your perspective, for having very sort of plush jails that were inmates. I can't remember his name. The mass shooter in Norway a few years ago apparently sued because he didn't get the video games that he wanted while he was in prison or something like that. But anyway, Norway is sort of sometimes even laughed at for having such accommodating prisons. But the truth is they actually work. Rehabilitation in Norway, rehabilitation of prisoners works enormously well there, and the recidivism rate is one of the lowest in the Western Hemisphere. And that's because they sort of treat prisoners as sort of human beings who can be fixed and not as people who are sort of broken or born evil and beyond redemption. So that's why I think we need to move to a rehabilitative system. That's where I think our criminal justice system needs to be moving in that direction. The question is, why aren't we and why can't we? And this is the problem I sort of deal with every day in my job, is writing about sort of the barriers to this. And the main problem is that our system is loaded with incentives, and I say our system, I'm referring to the system in the US, but I think this is kind of a universal thing. I think this is the nature of politics. This is the nature of when you have a system of sort of that administers punishment and punitive remedies, this is always going to happen. So in the US, our system is loaded with bad incentives right from the start. So let's start with politicians and policymakers, right? When you're running for election, you're not going to get a lot of votes by saying we need to be nicer to criminals, right? Nobody's going to vote for you that way. And in the US for a generation now, we've had politicians who've run on nothing but we need to get tougher on crime. And by that, they mean we need to give police and prosecutors more power. We need to strip people of their rights. and we need to make it easier to put people in prison for longer periods of time and easier to execute people. The problem, I think, is it's very easy to demagogue crime if you're a politician because crime is always going to exist, right? Even if you have any significant population, there's always going to be some crime, which means if I'm running for office and I want to scare people into voting for me, I can always point to a crime victim as somebody who I'm going to protect this person if you vote for me. If I'm the politician who's saying, yes, but if we implement these rehabilitative policies instead of these retributive policies, we're going to save lives because a lot of crimes that would have been committed otherwise are not going to be committed, right? And there's data and there's studies to back this up. But when I'm trying to get your vote, I can't point to the person who wasn't murdered and say, see, if you vote for me, there'll be more people like this who aren't murdered who otherwise would have been. That's just not something a politician can convincingly tell people. In the US, you would probably get laughed off the stage. However, it's true. And this is, in sort of economics, this is what they call the what is seen versus what is not seen. It's very difficult to make arguments about things that didn't happen that were prevented by good policy. It's much easier to sort of point to the bad things that have happened because of bad policy or just because of human nature. So the incentive for politicians is to demagogue these issues. It's to talk about, we need to do this for the children, right? There ought to be a law. We need to make this illegal. We need to make that illegal. And it becomes a very easy thing to run on. It becomes a very lazy thing to run on. One of my pet peeves in the U.S. that politicians love to do is they love to name laws after crime victims. And I've stated before, I think just out of principle, I think you should vote against any law that's named after something bad, somebody that something bad happened to. And the reason why is because it's not really an invitation to debate, right? It's saying, look at what happened, look at the terrible thing that happened to this person, and unless you support that law, you have no sympathy for that person, right? That is not a way to get good public policy. Good public policy should be made in a sort of emotion-free zone, right? We should be thinking clearly, we should be thinking with our minds, not with our hearts when we talk about policy. But politicians love to name bills after crime victims because it sort of frees them from the burden of having to actually discuss the merits of the law. We had a case in the U.S. a few years ago, the Casey Anthony case, which you may have heard of. I'm sure it made international news. But it's this woman who's accused of killing her own daughter, you know, it was all over the headlines. It made it was tabloid news for months and months. And a lot of legislatures responded with Kaylee's law, which is named after the little girl in the case. And I remember specifically in my home state of Tennessee, the senator that introduced the law specifically said that he wanted the law passed within 3 days of him introducing it so that people didn't have time to think about it much before they voted on it. That is the absolute worst way to pass a law, particularly a law that's going to have sort of far-reaching consequences. But I think that is the kind of the mentality that politicians want when they name laws after crime victims. Let's look at prosecutors, right? The district attorney, the prosecutor, the person who charges people and convicts them in these cases. For a prosecutor, every incentive is pushing them toward putting as many people in prison for as long as possible, right? When you're running for re-election, right? Let's say you're a prosecutor and you have a very high-profile case, a very nasty crime, and somebody's been arrested, and it's a high-profile person, and it's all over the newspapers, and you decide that there's just not enough evidence for you to charge that person, that it would not be in the interest of justice for you to charge that person, right? Are you going to put out a press release announcing this, saying, I just don't think it's in the interest of justice for me to charge this person? No, of course not. Prosecutors never put out press releases when they decide not to charge someone. They put out press releases when they're going to go after the bad guys, right? Because that's what gets the public's attention. That's what gets people to support them. That's what gets them reelected. That's what gives them a platform to run for higher office. Every incentive in a prosecutor's office nudges them toward longer sentences, more charges, throwing the book at people, basically. And it's gotten really bad in the United States. In Louisiana, a state in the South, sort of close to where I live, the prosecutors became so gung-ho about the death penalty that when they would win a death sentence in a case, they would throw a party for themselves. In some cases, they gave themselves plaques with that would have a little syringe on it for the lethal injection and the name of the person that they had just gotten the death sentence for. They would give each other ties with hangman's noose on them. One prosecutor in Louisiana had a little miniature electric chair on his desk that he would wind up and it would shock you when you touched it. And he had the pictures of the 5 men that he had sent to death row on the electric chair. Well, as it turned out, 3 of those 5 men were innocent. They were later exonerated by DNA testing. In Louisiana, I'm going to get my numbers right, I believe it's of the 111 people that the state has sent to death to death row over the last 35 years, 11 of them have been exonerated. They were completely innocent. So about a little less than 10% of the people that the state sent to death row were actually innocent. Now, I don't know what a good number of innocent people on death row is, but 10% seems pretty high. It would seem to me to indicate a system that's probably broken. In Dallas County, Texas, used to have one of the most sort of aggressive prosecutors in the United States. He died, I don't know, 15 years ago. But a few years ago, a more sort of progressive candidate ran and won the district attorney's seat in Dallas. And he started what he called a conviction integrity unit. And the job of this unit was to find bad convictions, find innocent people that have been sent to prison by his predecessor. And he found lots of them. In fact, Dallas County now has more exonerations than any other county in the United States. I would argue that's because they had this prosecutor who actually looked for them, right? But I interviewed this prosecutor, and he told me about the culture that used to exist in the old prosecutor's office. And he said that the prosecutors in the old office looked at a wrongful conviction as sort of a badge of honor, right? Because if you could send an innocent person to prison, that meant you were a really, really good prosecutor, right? You were top notch if you could pull that off. That is a system of a very sort of poisonous and toxic culture. And so the problem with this, so you have this incentive for prosecutors that everything's pushing them toward getting as many convictions as possible, putting as many people in prison as possible. There's nothing pushing back the other way. So in the United States, we have what's called the Brady Rule. It's named after a Supreme Court case, but the rule states that if you're a prosecutor and you find evidence in your case that is exculpatory to the defendant, that suggests that the defendant is innocent, you have to turn that evidence over to the defense, right? This is part of giving people a fair trial. If you have evidence that somebody's innocent, you can't just sit on it, you can't hide it. And recently, a pretty conservative justice, a federal judge in California, wrote about an epidemic of Brady violations among prosecutors in the US, that prosecutors were not turning over this evidence in these cases. They were getting caught left and right, but they were never getting punished for it. There were innocence cases. There were people who were wrongly sent to prison. A lot of cases the people are guilty anyway. That doesn't excuse the prosecutor or their obligation to turn this evidence over. But they were never punished for it. And in fact, if we're going to go back to Louisiana, I just wrote an article about Louisiana. The state bar, the group that punishes lawyers who misbehave, they handed out over 30,000 punishments over a 10-year period. 3 of those 30,000 went to prosecutors. The rest went to attorneys and all different other kinds of practice. But if you think about, this is the same state where I just told you that they had 11 people sent to death row who are innocent. You have this prosecutor who had the 3 people he sent to death row who are innocent. And yet, the group that's supposed to discipline bad attorneys in the state could only find 3 examples over 10 years out of 30,000 cases in which prosecutors had actually committed misconduct. I think part of the problem with why prosecutors have such bad incentives is that they're elected. Again, we go back to the elections. I think it's very easy to sort of run on an idea of I'm going to get tough on crime, I'm going to put the bad guys away, I'm not going to cut them any breaks. Whereas a prosecutor who runs on a platform of, well, I'm only going to charge people when there's enough evidence to charge them. I'm not going to sort of, I'm not going to stack charges against people to get guilty pleas. I'm going to try to take every case to trial so that people get a fair crack at justice. Voters don't really want to hear that. And I'll give you a good example of this. So in the United States, we elect all of our prosecutors. I think all but 2 states elect their prosecutors. But in most states, the public defender, the person who represents people who can't afford an attorney when they're accused of crimes, public defender is appointed. There are a couple of states, however, where the public defender is also elected. And in Florida recently, there was a guy who ran for public defender. He was a prosecutor, a lower-ranking prosecutor in the prosecutor's office, ran for public defender on a promise to basically eliminate the budget, the entire funding for the public defender's office. And he won, overwhelmingly. This is why democracy, I think, is sometimes incompatible with justice. I think there are certain rights that we have that we don't want to put up to a vote. And I think when we start electing positions within the criminal justice system, you run into these kinds of problems. There are several states in the United States that elect their state Supreme Court justices. And what we found in those states, there was a study by the Center for American Progress that found that in states that elect Supreme Court justices, if there are negative attack ads on justices during the campaign that accuse them of being soft on crime, those justices, if they win, are 25%, rule against criminal defendants 25% more of the time. So in other words, it has an effect, right? And these are, the way a judge rules in a criminal case, these are constitutional issues. These are questions of law. These are not questions of democracy. These aren't questions that we leave up to voters. And yet, the fact that in some states we subject the judiciary to the democratic process, I think, is hurting the rule of law and it's hurting the process of justice. I want to talk a little bit about police and forensics. So one area that I do a lot of writing on, and that my next book is about, is forensics. And this is the allegedly science that police use to solve crimes and to convict people. The problem is that most fields of forensics, the ones you see on TV, from fingerprinting to hair fiber analysis to bite mark analysis especially, these are not sciences. These were techniques that were invented in police departments, not in science labs. And they were invented for the purpose of helping police officers solve crimes, or usually more to the point, they were invented for the purpose of helping police officers sort of confirm who they already thought committed the crime. They aren't subject to the scientific method. They're not subject to things like peer review or blind testing or what we sort of associate with scientific review. And yet, for decades and decades and decades, we've let juries hear forensic analysts' testimony as if it were science. We present it to juries as if it were science. And it just isn't. There's just no... So bite mark evidence is one I've written a lot about. And this idea that you can find a bite in human skin and you can sort of analyze it and trace it to one person's teeth, right, to the exclusion of everybody else on the planet. And there are about 36 people in the United States, actually way more than that. There have been 24 people who have been convicted based on bite mark science who were later exonerated by DNA testing. We don't know how many people are actually in prison based on bite mark testimony still. But it is not science. They can't even calculate a margin for error. These are very subjective. It's an area of forensics they call pattern matching. It's when an analyst will look at one pattern and look at another pattern and say, yeah, those look like a match, or no, those don't look like a match. This is what they do with hair fiber. It's what they do with tire tread analysis, with shoe print analysis, and even fingerprinting. Fingerprinting is not nearly as sort of foolproof as you see on TV. Fingerprinting is valuable, don't get me wrong. I'm not saying it's as bad as bite mark evidence, but it does have its problems and it's often overstated. The only reason why we know now that forensics is as flawed as it is because of DNA testing. Well, DNA testing was developed in a science lab. It was subjected to peer review in the scientific method. We have DNA testing because it came from the field of science, and it was DNA testing that exposed all of these areas of forensics as being fraudulent for the most part. And yet, DNA testing has exposed all these areas of forensics as being fraudulent, and yet the only cases we can get courts to review in the United States are cases where DNA definitively says that somebody's innocent. This is a little bit complicated. I hope this comes through with the translation. The set of cases for which DNA testing is dispositive of guilt is very small. It's about 5 to 10% of criminal cases, right? But the forensics flaws and the other flaws in the criminal justice system that led to the exonerations in those 5 to 10% of cases exist in every case. They exist in all the other cases as well, right? But we don't have DNA testing in those other cases to tell us where we went wrong. And so the problem now is that the courts have said, they just kind of shrugged. They said, okay, well, if DNA testing says you're innocent, then we'll let you out. But if you're unlucky enough to be in a case where DNA doesn't matter, we're not going to review it. Even if the same guy that even if the same forensic expert who put this person in prison, who was exonerated, is also the guy who put you in prison, we're not going to review your case because there's no DNA. And this is a huge problem. DNA has been this sort of wake-up call that something's wrong, and we haven't really heeded the warning. The problem with forensics is that there are many problems with it. One is that it was conceived of in a police lab. It's not science, but it's presented to juries as if it were science. But number two, there's a huge incentive problem with forensics analysts as well. In the US, most crime labs are under the auspices of the police agency. So they're seen as sort of part of the police team, right? There was a recent investigative article in the state of North Carolina, the crime lab there, where the analysts reported directly to prosecutors. And the prosecutors did the year-end reviews of all the analysts. The prosecutors decided if the analysts got promotions or raises. These are the people who are supposed to be sort of impartial, who are supposed to be scientists, right? Sure. Sure. So in North Carolina, the crime lab scientists, they're supposed to be objective, right, impartial, but they were reporting to prosecutors. The prosecutors were deciding if they get raises, if they get promotions. Now you can see how that would be a problem, right? So when the newspaper did the investigation, they checked that there was a surveillance video in the crime lab, and in one instance they saw these two analysts. They were doing a blood spatter analysis in a case. And they kept doing the experiment over and over again because it wasn't giving them the results that the prosecutor wanted. And when they finally got the results that the prosecutor wanted, they gave each other a high five on the video. But they never told the defense that they did all these other experiments beforehand that didn't come up with the right result. So you can see why this could be a huge problem. There's another study that came out a few years ago by a guy named Roger Koppel, who I've worked with in the past, found that in about a dozen states in the US and in several more cities, crime lab analysts are only paid when their work gets a conviction. So if the prosecutor comes to you with this evidence and says, here's the blood and here's who we think did it, and you do your analysis and says, well, no, that person's innocent, you don't get, your lab doesn't get any money for that. There's no fee that comes with it. If you come back and say, oh yeah, he did it, then your lab gets money and you get paid. Now you can imagine, again, these are supposed to be sort of objective, neutral analysts, and they're getting paid only when they convict people. This is a huge, huge problem. Oh, this one's kind of fun. So, my next book is about the state of Mississippi, and for 20 years in Mississippi, one doctor has been doing basically all the autopsies in the state. So about 15 to 1,800 autopsies per year, one doctor was doing in Mississippi. And the reason why is that the way it would work in Mississippi is when there was a suspicious death, a murder or a death by negligence, the prosecutor would take the body and he would take it to a private doctor for autopsy. And he would pay the doctor about $1,000, I think. And that doctor would then come back to the prosecutor and say, here's what I found, here's what happened. Well, in the real world, the way this works is the prosecutor would say, he would bring the body to the doctor and he would say, here's what I need you to tell me happened. And if the doctor comes back and says, well, no, that's not what happened, or if the doctor comes back and says, there's not enough evidence for me to say that's what happened, well, then he wouldn't get the next referral. They would find another doctor who would tell them what they wanted to hear. And so this guy, Stephen Hain, was able to basically monopolize the autopsy system in Mississippi by telling prosecutors exactly what they needed to get convictions. And so he was literally doing 15 to 1,800 autopsies per year, which if you do the math, is crazy. He was doing them from the basement of a funeral home. And to give you an idea of sort of the kinds of things that this guy was willing to say to get more business from prosecutors, I'm going to tell you about a case. There's a case where a 13-year-old boy was accused of murder. And he was accused of murdering his sister's husband, who was allegedly abusive. And the prosecutor's theory was that they teamed up and did it together, that the brother and sister waited until the husband was asleep, and then they held the gun and pulled the trigger together at the same time to kill the husband, right? So maybe that happened, maybe it didn't. I wasn't there, who knows? But this doctor, this medical examiner, he gets on the witness stand and he says that he can tell by the bullet holes in the body that there were two hands on the gun that fired the bullets, that two people were holding the gun that fired the bullets. Now, think about that. It's preposterous, right? There's no possible way you could tell that. That's like saying you can tell what color of eyes the killer had by the knife wounds, right? It's just not possible. And yet this is the kind of thing that this doctor was willing to say. And he wasn't even the worst one. He had a sort of a sidekick named Michael West. And this was the bite mark guy. His specialty was the bite marks. But he did more than bite marks. I'll tell you about his most ridiculous case. In this case, 3 elderly people were stabbed to death. And the police had their suspect. But they didn't have a whole lot of evidence against him. And so they went to Michael West, this dentist who had claimed all these sort of forensic superpowers. And they said, well, here's who we think did it, and here's what we think the murder weapon was. And they gave him a knife that they found in the kitchen of one of the victims. There was no blood on the knife. There's actually no indication that the knife was actually the murder weapon, but they thought it was for whatever reason. And so Michael West takes the knife, and he looks at the stab wounds in the victims, and he says that only this knife could have created those stab wounds. No other knife, right? This, again, is impossible. Human skin doesn't record sort of the intricacies of a knife blade in a way that you could distinguish one knife from every other knife, right? It's possible if you had a very tiny stab wound and a really huge knife, you could say, no, that knife did not create that wound, right? Or vice versa. But there's no way you could possibly say that this knife and only this knife could have created those wounds. But Dr. West wasn't done. So all he's done now is he's established that this knife was the murder weapon, or he thinks he has. But he still has to tie the knife to the suspect. So he does what he calls the West phenomenon. This is a thing that he invented. He puts on these yellow goggles and he shines a fluorescent light on the suspect's hands. And he claims to have found tiny little indentations on the suspect's hands that he said could only have come from gripping this knife and stabbing people with it, that nothing else could have caused these particular indentations. Now, this was 2 weeks after the crime had been committed. So think of all the other things that this guy probably gripped, or held in his hand in the time in between. And yet West was claiming that he could see these marks that nobody else could see, only him, that said only this knife could have been caused by gripping this knife. he wasn't done yet. When it was time for the trial, he said he had messed up and had overexposed the film that he took of the marks on the hand. So he took the defendant to a copy machine, and he made photocopies of his hands, and then drew in the marks that he claimed to have seen with a magic marker from his own memory. So this is what he showed the jury. He didn't even show the jury photographs. He showed them basically a drawing that he made from memory of the photographs. And the guy was convicted. The judge allowed the evidence in. The guy was convicted. Michael West went on testifying for years and years and years afterward. This is kind of the state of forensics in the US, and just how it's a good illustration of just how far removed from science forensics has become. Bite mark evidence, incidentally, every scientific study that has looked at bite mark analysis has determined that there's no scientific foundation for it. The two underlying assumptions behind bite mark analysis is that all human teeth are unique, which there's no proof of that, and that skin is capable of recording that uniqueness in a way that can be analyzed, and there's no proof of that either. So far, I think there have been 5 or 6 different scientific studies in the last 7 or 8 years and all of them have found there's no scientific basis for bite mark analysis, and yet, to date, every single time bite mark evidence has been challenged in US courts as unscientific, the judge has ruled against the challenge. The judge has upheld bite mark evidence. So we've got 36 people who were convicted based on bite mark evidence who were later exonerated. We have a mountain of scientific evidence saying that bite mark analysis has no scientific validity. We have no scientific research saying it has any scientific value at all, and yet the courts still refuse to ban it from the courtroom. And in fact, they continue to allow it into the courtroom. This is why, again, this is another incentive problem when we get to judges, which is that the criminal court system at the trial level, they talk about we have an adversarial system in the US, that everybody gets to present their side and everything's open. But once you get that verdict, once the jury says guilty, the system switches, and now it puts a premium on finality. It's this idea that we don't want to admit we're wrong too often because that will undermine people's faith in the system. And so it becomes very, very difficult to overturn bad verdicts, particularly based on bad science, without anything other than DNA testing. I want to talk very quickly. How much time do I have? About 5 more minutes. I'll talk very quickly about police and privatization. So in the US, we're in a privatization kick. I'm not always opposed to privatization. I think sometimes it can work. For example, with crime labs, I think if you had a private crime lab that was sometimes sort of double checking the state crime lab's work, I think you could create a system where you switch the incentives from trying to get convictions to trying to not be wrong, because sooner or later you're going to get caught, right? But there are other times when privatization creates really perverse incentives. A good example is probation. So in the US, a lot of states are privatizing their probation systems. Well, if you think about probation, the whole purpose of probation is to help someone sort of make the transition from prison back into society, right? Well, the problem with privatized probation is the probation companies make all of their money from the probationers. When you pay basically for this private probation service, well, if you're a private probation company and every person that you successfully get off of probation and back into society is one less customer that's paying your probation company, right? And so what we've seen with privatized probation, states that have privatized probation, is much, much, much higher incidences of probation officers accusing people of, missing meetings, of violating probation in some way or another, of, hanging out with shady people or drinking or violating their probation. And it becomes basically the incentive is not to help people make the transition, but to just keep people perpetually on probation for as long as possible so that they stay paying customers. I have a lot more to talk about and not very much time. Well, I'm going to skip the police stuff because that would be another 20 minutes or so. But I want to talk about solutions. I don't want to be completely negative. How can we sort of, get past all of this? And one thing that's happening in the U.S. that I think is very encouraging, and I don't know, maybe it can happen here. I'm obviously not as familiar with your political system. But there's been a very strong political reaction in recent years, particularly in the last 3 or 4 years. And what we've seen is people sort of targeting particularly abusive district attorneys. I would say in the last 4 or 5 years, we've seen district attorneys who've been in office for a really long time lose in elections because people sort of had enough. And I said before that if you're a prosecutor, all the incentives sort of nudge you toward putting as many people in prison for as long as possible, and there's nothing pushing back the other way. Well, all it takes is a couple of elections, right? A couple of high-profile cases where a DA gets knocked off for being too aggressive, and now every other prosecutor in the country might sort of have that in the back of their mind, right? Now there is a little bit of an incentive to maybe not go so far. And so we're seeing more and more of that. In New York City, the last mayoral election actually turned on an issue of police brutality or police excessive force, the stop and frisk policy. In New York, police were stopping, particularly in black communities. There were people who were getting stopped every 4 or 5 times they left their own house. And it became an issue because people made it an issue in the political process. Again, I don't know how feasible sort of turning to politics would be in Russia, but in the U.S., we have seen some results with that. I think there is understanding incentives is important. Understanding how incentives work is important. We need to understand that sort of what is best for police officers isn't always what's best for community safety or the safety of the community. People tend to merge those two things, and they're not always the same. Understanding incentives when it comes to bias. So the crime lab example I gave. One sort of solution to the problem with biased crime labs is, this is something Roger Koppel came up with, and I think it's brilliant. Let's say every 4 or 5 cases, you send a piece of the evidence to this private crime lab. The state crime lab is still doing all the analysis, but every few times you send the same evidence to a private crime lab for independent analysis. The state crime lab analysts never know which cases they're being double-checked on, right? So now you've suddenly switched the incentive, right? Before, if you're a state crime lab analyst, your incentive was you wanted to please the prosecutor who was doing your job evaluations, right? Or you wanted to please the police group that was overseeing you. Now it's you don't want to be embarrassed. You don't want the state crime lab to see that you were faking results or maybe tilting results or putting your thumb on the scale. Understanding sort of how incentives work and sort of changing the system and altering the system in a way that factors in that we're all sort of human and that we all have our own interests. There's a theory of economics called public choice theory that states that just because people are working for the government, just because people work for the state, that doesn't sort of magically make them altruistic, right? They're still sort of human, they're still self-interested, they're still going to kind of act in their own self-interest. And we need to design our system in a way that accommodates that factors that in. Not because we think people are terrible, but because that's the reality is that people are human, that this is how people act. And particularly, when it comes to something like criminal justice, where the stakes are so high, we need to make sure that we get it right. In the end, I would just say the criminal justice system is a human system. It's always going to be evolving. It's always going to be changing. We need to sort of make sure that what we're putting into it, if you have a system that's loaded with bad incentives that it doesn't sort of factor in unintended consequences, it doesn't factor in the problem with perverse incentives, you can have the best people in the world operating within that system, but if all the incentives are off, either the good people are going to turn bad or they're going to leave in frustration, and the system is eventually going to be populated with people who don't care. You have to sort of fix this. And when I write about police officers, when I write about prosecutors, when I write about judges, I always try to emphasize that, this isn't a criticism of them on a personal level. This is a criticism of a system that sort of they find themselves operating in. And we have to fix that system, because until we do, it doesn't matter sort of how good or bad the people in that system are, we're still going to get the same bad results. Thank you for inviting me out to talk to you tonight, and I'd be happy to take questions.
Так, пожалуйста, если у вас есть вопросы, поднимайте руку, представляйте и говорите в микрофон. Сейчас, секунду. Do you have your earphone?
Oh, yeah. I don't know how this works exactly. Just put it up to my ear. Got it. Yep.
Hello, thank you very much for the lecture. It was very interesting, and I can feel that you are very passionate about what you are talking about. The first question, those private lab that would check the state lab, who would finance it and why? Because if the private lab is financed by the taxes, don't they have the same motivation as the state lab?
Right, it's a good question. So ideally what would happen is this, when you set up a system like this, it would be done very openly, and so that it would be done with an eye toward improving the way forensics are done. The state lab would still be sort of reported, those analysts would still report to prosecutors or whatever police group they're usually under. The private lab would not report to them. The private lab would be completely independent. Their sole job would be as quality control. They're just going to do their own analysis. The other thing you'd have is the way the plan would be set up. There's somebody called an evidence handler, and this person would be a person who would sort of set all this up. A lot of times you could set these tests up so that the analysts themselves don't know who the guilty person is, right? I mean, that's ideally how you want to do it anyway. But it would be taxpayer funded. It would be, but the independent lab, the private lab itself would not report to any state actor. It would still just sort of exist independently. And the Roger Koppel, the academic who came up with this idea, actually estimated the cost, and he said you could run a system like this for about 10 to 15 years for what it costs an average state for one wrongful conviction. So when somebody gets wrongly convicted and then exonerated, if you factor up the cost of prosecuting that person, the cost of keeping that person in prison, and the cost of compensating that person afterward, usually they get $50,000 to $100,000 per year that they were wrongly imprisoned. He says, for the cost of one wrongful conviction, you could fund a system like this for 5 to 10 years. I think it was 5 to 10 years, which doesn't seem like a huge price to pay, because I think it would actually cut down dramatically on wrongful convictions. Again, though, you run into this problem where you're going to be, when you're pitching this idea to voters, you're going to have to say, we're going to be saving a lot of money by. There's nobody you can point to say this person would have been convicted if it weren't for this program, because that person wasn't convicted, so there's nobody to point to. So it's a difficult sell. You're asking states to spend more money based on something that hasn't happened yet, which is difficult. No state has tried it yet, by the way.
Hi. So we see that election is a bad way to choose a new prosecutor. And do you have an idea what would be a better way to choose a new prosecutor?
Yes, it's a great question, and I was afraid somebody was going to ask me that. It's tough because appointing, if you appoint prosecutors, that comes with its own set of problems, right? You get cronyism, you get problems with accountability if you're not answerable to the voters. I mean, I just told you that democracy is a huge problem with is a big contributor to the problems we have with prosecutors. And then at the end of my lecture, I told you that, you know, democracy is the solution, right? That we need to get more involved in prosecutors' elections. It's difficult. I mean, the issue of democracy, how much democracy we need in the criminal justice system, is a really fascinating one. And I think there hasn't been a lot of academic work on it. I'd like to see a lot more because, so for example, in the US, sheriffs tend to be elected. So, you know, in the US we have counties and then we have cities. The county sheriff, the person who's in charge of law enforcement for the entire county, tends to be elected. The police chief in the city tends to be appointed. And I think there's some really interesting things to look at, comparisons to make. Which one is more answerable? Which one does a better job? I don't know the answer. I think there are examples on both sides. I do think the evidence is pretty conclusive when it comes to judges, that appointing them is better than electing them. Electing them creates all sorts of problems, especially when it comes to financing campaigns. But I don't know with prosecutors. It's a really tough call. I don't have a good answer for that.
Thank you so much for the presentation. My question is...
You are such good English speakers, I don't even need this.
Yeah, I guess. So my question is kind of following. So to me as a scientist, what you told us about the laboratory sounds totally wild and weird. And this is kind of, you know, crime when you're trying to repeat your experiment until you get the right result.
Right.
But the scientific society is kind of, you know, self-regulating society, because it's a great shame to be caught on repeating experiment to get the right result. So that's why we just kind of invented the way to exclude the personal preferences from the process, which is called like double-blind testing and so on and so on. So why is it impossible to bring these laboratories back to science out of the police system?
Because it doesn't serve them to do that. Look, this was a system that was designed to help police and prosecutors do their job. If you start subjecting it to actual science, if you start subjecting it to double-blind testing and peer review and statistical analysis, it's going to make it harder for police and prosecutors to convict people, and they don't want that. Yeah, I know, it's absurd, right? Because it means when they do convict people, it's always going to be the right person, which you'd think they would want. But I can't explain it. You know, we just had President Obama, to his credit, started a forensic science commission within the White House. And they looked at all of these pattern matching disciplines with forensics, and they basically said, you know, there's no science to this whatsoever. This is a huge problem. It's hugely flawed. And Obama's own Attorney General, Loretta Lynch, just dismissed the report out of hand, said we're not going to implement it at the Justice Department. The FBI is going to do it's going to do its own internal regulating of science, which the FBI, there aren't any scientists at the FBI, right? They're all investigators. And then when Donald Trump was elected, Jeff Sessions, his Attorney General, not only continued that policy, he disbanded the Forensic Commission altogether. Just said, we don't even want this commission around anymore. So, you know, you're trying to change a culture that's been ingrained and has been, this has been the way they've done things for you know, decades. And that's a very, very difficult thing to do. You would think that DNA testing would have, you know, woken people up and have gotten the public, and it did get the public angry, but it wasn't, it was enough momentum for people to start saying, oh wait, maybe there's some problems. It did not generate enough momentum to make really sort of lasting solutions. And I'll tell you, the thing that I find really scary about this is that DNA testing is not a panacea, it's a wake-up call. It should have told us that there are problems, system-wide problems that we need to fix, right? But as I told you, the pool of cases for which DNA is a factor is small. It's 5 to 10%. As I also told you, the problems that we discovered in those 5 to 10% of cases exist throughout the system, right? If we don't fix the problem, going forward, in those 5 to 10% of cases for which DNA matters, the DNA testing is going to be done at the start of all of those cases, right? So in that small pool of cases, basically rape cases and some murder cases, the criminal justice system is going to do a lot better. It's usually going to get it right. In the other 90% of cases, it's going to continue to get it wrong, and there's not going to be another DNA breakthrough to sort of wake us up again. We're just going to sort of blindly go forward with the public thinking, you know, oh, we got it right now, when we haven't. We haven't actually made the fixes that we needed. We've just corrected this very small pool of cases. That's a terrifying thing to think about.
Добрый день, но вам все-таки придется воспользоваться наушником. Хотелось бы уточнить, вот исходя из того, что вы говорили, о том, что придется перепроверять те же самые лаборатории, но зачастую, если я правильно понимаю вашу судебную систему, то будут перепроверены все дела. В некоторых случаях, скажем, во время получения доказательной базы она может быть получена незаконно, или те же самые доказательства будут непригодны для проведения тестов. И, скажем, в определенных случаях данные доказательства были притянуты за уши, но все-таки уверенность в том, что данное лицо совершило данное преступление, все-таки присутствует. Ну, скажем, недостаточно доказательная база, или она была, но была нарушена процедура ее получения. То не будет странным, что в результате пересмотра всех дел большое количество преступников, которые были законно, с одной стороны, посажены в тюрьму, будут снова оправданы и выпущены на свободу. И снова таки общество будет подвержено еще большему риску, чем если посадить несколько невиновных.
Well, I think in cases so there are cases where DNA or where the forensic evidence was conclusive, right? Where if the semen that was found in the victim's vagina after a rape case doesn't match you, then you are not the rapist, right? In those cases, yeah, that person would be released, and I think we would want that person to be released, right? In other cases, you know, it may be that, let's say, there are cases, for example, where there might be a hair found at the crime scene that doesn't, you know, that a hair fiber analyst said matches the defendant. And we go back and we relook at that, and it's like, oh no, you know, it doesn't match the defendant, or we can't really say that it definitively matches the defendant, or, you know, maybe we could say it matches 50% of the population and the defendant is part of that population, but that's not, you know, that's not enough to convict someone. However, we also have the defendant, you know, on surveillance video repeatedly stabbing the victim, right? So in those cases, you know, the forensic evidence would need to be reviewed, and you know, we want to know if the state crime lab is getting it wrong, even in cases where it doesn't necessarily affect the outcome, because we want to know which analysts are doing a good job and which ones aren't. But there are cases, I gave you a very extreme example, but there are cases where, you know, re-examining the forensic evidence may sort of make the person seem less guilty, but it wouldn't completely exonerate them. And in those cases, we go back to a judge and we say, is there enough to give this person a new trial? Is it enough to free this person entirely? You know, it is a sliding scale. It's not always going to be a definite yes or no, or guilty or not guilty. But you know, I think in those cases, look, with the medical examiner in Mississippi that I was talking about, you know, in that case where he talked about the two hands on the gun, that was preposterous. It was just transparent ridiculous, right? No science behind that whatsoever. There are lots of other cases where he's testified, where he's said something, he's given an opinion that was, you know, plausible. It was scientifically plausible. He was opposed by another medical examiner who said, I don't think it happened that way, and his opinion was also scientifically plausible. And both of them were, and the jury sided with Dr. Hain because they found him more convincing. My argument is, if Dr. Hain is willing to give testimony that is so preposterous as the two hands on the gun theory, why should we let juries give his testimony equal weight as another medical examiner, even in those cases where he gave testimony that was, you know, plausible? I think once you've sort of shown yourself to be a flawed analyst or a lying analyst or an analyst who doesn't know what he's talking about, you should sort of be removed. So I think there's value in double checking the work of these analysts, even if we're not necessarily freeing everyone every time there's a mistake. And I don't think we should. I think it has to be evaluated on a case-by-case basis. Did that answer your question?
Спасибо за вашу лекцию. У меня следующий вопрос. Когда сокращается количество преступлений, это полиция хуже начинает работать или общество становится лучше?
Okay, gotcha. I think there are there's some aspects of policing that can affect the crime rate in a given community. I think on a national level, I think when the crime rate falls, I think it's more about societal changes. In the US, by the way, crime has fallen dramatically since about 1992. Murder rate, I think, has fallen by 60 or 70%. In New York, it's fallen by 90%. The crime rate is, I mean, you wouldn't know it by listening to Donald Trump, but our crime rate is historically low in the US right now. And criminologists are sort of tripping over themselves trying to figure out why. They can't really explain it. And there are a number of really interesting explanations. I think the two that are probably most, I find most convincing right now are lead. There's a lot of evidence that childhood exposure to lead can cause criminality later because I guess it sort of attacks the part of the brain that deals with impulse control. And we started regulating lead in gasoline and paint at about the time the crime rate started falling. But the other is just our society, the US society is getting older and people commit fewer crimes as they get older, as I mentioned earlier. But I also think as standards of living increase, you see less crime. Generally, Steven Pinker, the author, has a great book out a few years ago called The Better Angels of Our Nature, I think. But he talks about how, and again, the last few years notwithstanding, as a general rule, things are getting better with humanity. There's less war, there's less crime, there's less conflict in general. We are sort of progressively getting to become a better species. And I think we're going to continue to see that. I think the crime rate, and I think the crime rate generally in the developed world has been dropping over the last 20 years or so. In the US, it's gone up just a little bit over the last 2 or 3 years. I personally think that's just kind of a statistical blip. I mean, it can't keep going down forever, right? At some point, it's going to come up a little bit. But I think, so to answer your question, I think on the local level, I think police can do some things to help fight crime, but I think on a broader level, I think it's more about sort of societal changes.
Спасибо. Рэдли, большое спасибо вам за лекцию, было крайне интересно. Вопрос, касающийся первой части лекции по поводу реабилитации в тюрьмах. Если тюрьмы будут в основном рассчитаны на реабилитацию преступников, не будет результатом этого снижение мотивации преступников не попасть в эти тюрьмы. То есть, условно говоря, преступник понимает, что да, я совершу преступление, даже если меня поймают, то я попаду в тюрьму, и для меня будет, условно говоря, я проведу несколько лет, как в доме отдыха. И для него это не будет так страшно, и под конец это еще больше подтолкнет его к преступлению. Спасибо.
Sure, that's a very fair question. I'm not convinced that fear of prison stops people from committing crimes. I think particularly when you look at, I mean, most of the time murder is a crime of sort of passion or emotion. Drug crimes particularly are usually, people who don't have other sort of economic opportunities, and the drug war presents a very, very lucrative one. So I'm not convinced that sort of fear of getting beaten or raped in prison actually dissuades people from committing crimes. I think it does, what it does do is it persuades people to accept plea bargains, for example. So, you know, if you're facing, if the prosecutor is saying, you know, you can plead guilty and get probation, or you can take this to trial, and if you lose, you're looking at 5 to 10 years in prison. I think the fear of what could happen to you in prison will persuade a lot of people to take the probation offer, including a lot of innocent people, by the way. Yeah, and I should say, I mean, I don't have a lot of data to back up my opinion on that. That's just an opinion. But my hunch, though, is that, you know, I don't think people want necessarily to be criminals. I think, you know, a lot of times it has to do with impulse control. I think a lot of times it has to do with, you know, sort of their social status or economic conditions. I think there are genuinely sociopathic, dangerous people out there, and I think those people do need to be locked up and kept from society. But I think for most people, particularly people who commit crimes, you know, when they're younger, I don't think fear of prison is going to stop them. And I do think that, you know, even if that does have an effect, I think the benefits of having a prison more focused on rehabilitation would outweigh that. What else? Yep.
Mr. Balko, many thanks for your performance, because I think this topic is very sensitive for each society, not for USA, but here in Russia Federation, as I was an investigator, and I fully agree with you, what you said. And my question is next, what do you think, maybe there is one more reason to put more people who are criminality, to put them in prison, because it can be one of option to control the society. Because for example, I'm a tax player, and the society is very development, and the level of criminal is not very high. And I think why I should pay taxes for prosecutor, for courts, for jails, and the government answer me, you stupid, see, there's so many criminals,
yeah.
Don't you see? What do you think about it?
Yeah, I mean, I think when you start classifying wide swaths of the population as criminals, it's a way it's a way of playing to people's fears. And you know, you mentioned the fact that you're a taxpayer. It's in my notes, I didn't mention it, but that the study in the San Francisco jail where they did this sort of intensive counseling and career counseling with the inmates and had this dramatic effect. They also found that for every $1 they spent on the counseling program, they saved $4 because the inmates who went through the program got out. They got out with sort of counseling, they got out with job prospects, they didn't come back into the jail, so the jail population actually went down. They also had fewer violent incidents that they had to respond to, which means, you know, fewer guards that they have to pay, fewer medical bills that they have to pay when things go wrong. So it actually is cheaper, and actually this is, I mean, it's a kind of a little discussed, but fairly widely known fact that, you know, when the U.S. Banned alcohol in the 1920s during alcohol prohibition, we saw basically all the same things that we see with the drug prohibition today, right? As soon as we banned alcohol, the homicide rate soared, went straight up, right? Why? Well, because when you ban something that people want, you create a black market, and when you have a black market, the people who operate on that market settle disputes not in courts of law, right? But by killing each other. You know, you rarely hear about a Michelob or a Budweiser deal gone bad, right? Because there are ways that, you know, legitimate alcohol companies deal with disputes. They win customers with better products and lower prices, not by killing their competitors. When alcohol prohibition, it was a huge failure. The homicide rate was through the roof. Public corruption soared. deaths by alcoholism soared, because when you make a product illegal that people want, there's a premium on dealers to make it a very high potency, because you're smuggling it, and the higher potency is you can then dilute it after you get it through. Well, people were making gin in their bathtubs, right? They were making alcohol out of wood. Nobody dies in the US, nobody goes blind from drinking bathtub gin in the US anymore, right? We have lots of alcohol that we can buy that's, not going to kill us. Well, it kills us more slowly, I guess. But my point here is that, I am getting to a point, which is that Prohibition was a disastrous failure. It should have been repealed for all of those reasons. The reason it was actually repealed, though, is that politicians, we were in the Great Depression, and state governments needed money. And they saw that all these people were drinking alcohol anyway, despite the fact that it was illegal, and they weren't getting any tax revenue from it. So they legalized alcohol basically just so that the states could get tax revenue, because they needed the money during the Depression. We're seeing the same thing now with criminal justice reform in the US. Surprisingly, to a lot of people, criminal justice reform right now is being led by very conservative states, states on the right in the US. And the reason is not because they have any added extra compassion for criminals or the rights of the accused. It's because they've realized, they've crunched the numbers, and they've realized that, stockpiling people in prisons is hugely expensive, and it's a drain on their budgets, and they want to cut taxes for rich people. And the best way to do that is to save money by stop putting so many people in prison. And so we are seeing actually some of the most dramatic reforms in the US right now are coming from pretty conservative states, and they're doing it because they need to save money.
Okay, let's have 2 last questions.
Здравствуйте, меня зовут Игорь, и мой вопрос. Стивен Левит и Стивен Дабнер в книге «Фрикономика» рассказали, что снижение уровня преступности в 90-х годах произошло не благодаря заслугам полиции и Рудольфа Джулиани, а благодаря легализации абортов в 70-х годах. Так ли это по-вашему, и происходят ли сейчас какие-либо процессы явные или скрытые, которые повлияют на уровень преступности в сторону уменьшения в будущем? Спасибо.
Could you ask me something controversial, please? That is hugely controversial in the U.S., that question. It's an interesting theory. I've seen some people debunk it. I favor abortion rights, but I'm not convinced that their argument is necessarily true. I do think that the lead exposure, there's a lot of good data and evidence for that. I also think that the aging population has pretty strong evidence for it. I think there's something to it, maybe. The interesting thing is, as I said, when the crime rate dropped, or once we realized how dramatically it dropped, criminologists were tripping over themselves to come up with the explanation, because whoever came up with it, was going to be famous. And the Freakonomics explanation about abortion was definitely one of them that made a lot of noise. There are lots and lots and lots of other ones, though. I've always found it to be interesting. I mean, all these papers came out claiming, that the crime, that this was responsible for X percentage of the crime drop. I always thought it'd be interesting and they all claim to be statistically significant and peer-reviewed. And I always thought it'd be interesting to sort of add them all up and see, how much the crime rate actually dropped if all of these statistically significant peer-reviewed papers were correct. I'm not really answering your question because I don't have a strong opinion on that particular one. It's very, very interesting. It's very provocative, but I'm just not. I don't have a strong opinion either way on it, which is probably not very satisfying for you. Sorry. Last one, but I'd be happy to stick around and chat with people too if you have more questions.
Thank you very much for the interesting talk. And I just want to ask you, because you mentioned that some state, I just don't remember what one, they had this experiment with the educational programs. So the level of the violation in the prison decreased and it dropped to 0 dramatically. So was it like the experiment, or is it becoming the common practice in states? Because it totally makes sense in terms of when people, uneducated people, get the education being in prison, they have this chance to start over and like have more perspectives when they get out of prison, right?
Yeah, I mean, I hope it gets replicated. It was relatively recent, so I think it's probably still being sort of mulled over and reviewed. I will say this, I mean, you know, you get an education in prison of some kind, no matter what. You know, hopefully it's a job education and counseling. But I mean, this is part of the problem with the incarceration state, though, is that, you know, we put people in prison for low-level offenses, for drug crimes, for non-violent offenses. And prisons are incredibly violent and dangerous places. And so what we do is we take non-violent people, people who maybe were, you know, dealing or pushing drugs for whatever reason, and then we put them in with violent criminals, and they come out violent. And that's a huge problem. And it's going to be a problem, actually, you know, even with the policies I advocate, which is, you know, letting a lot of these drug offenders out. We have to be prepared for that. We have to be prepared for the fact that a lot of these people went in non-violent and are going to come out with violent tendencies just because of the nature of our prisons and because we've decided that we need to punish people by having violent prisons. That is another sort of cost of the system that we have. But to answer your question, I don't know that it's being replicated yet. I do know, you know, there are a lot of prisons that are doing more for reentry of prisoners. Sort of, they're trying to prepare them when they get out a little better. There are a lot of states that still don't, though, sadly. In fact, there are a lot of states that still don't even compensate people who are exonerated, which is, you know, a travesty, in my opinion. But it is getting better, and there are groups now, nonprofit groups, that have sprung up to also help people with reentry. But this is an important point, I think. You know, if we on the reform side of things, if we want more people to be released, we also have to support sort of the initiatives and the programs. And, you know, as a libertarian, I personally as a libertarian, it's kind of a tough sell sometimes to say, well, we also need to make sure that these people, you know, have government-provided education and job training before they re-enter the workforce. But I do think, as a libertarian, it's important. If we think that these people were wronged because they were put in prison for crimes that should never be punishable by incarceration in the first place, then I think we are obligated to sort of help those people become productive members of society when they get out, both for them and for us, because it benefits us if they're productive as well. Well, thank you very much. You've been a great audience. These were terrific questions. And I'd be happy to sort of stick around and chat with people, I don't know, out back. I don't know if they're going to throw us out, but I'd be happy to chat with people if you want to afterwards. If you want to take more questions, I'd be happy to.
Давайте уже вопросы оставим на такую кулуарную часть, да, и вот это официальную завершим. Я хочу напомнить вам, что наш цикл «Зомби-идеи» продолжается. 25 июля к нам приедет выступать Константин Сонин. Он будет рассказывать про зомби-меркантилиста, да, значит, про такую идею, да, про то, что на самом деле рынок, он сводится к такой борьбе всех со всеми. Да, и приходите. Вот, и еще я хотел вам отдельно рассказать про нашу программу, которая сейчас тоже идет. В начале июля мы будем делать в Москве двухдневный тренинг «Постправда». Может быть, он вас тоже заинтересует. Да, в течение 2 дней мы будем проводить лекции и семинары, игры и тренинги, которые посвящены тому, как научиться отличать фейки от нефейков, как понимать, кто кому, ну, если вас обманывают или пытаются это сделать, и вообще, что разные представители разных социальных наук думают о проблеме лжи и правды в обществе. Вот, эта программа платная. Если хотите, можете посмотреть на сайте InLiberty, там про нее написано. До встречи. Спасибо.